Last summer, my wife, Emily, went away for a week to help her mother around the house, which she does from time to time. They have a close relationship, and Emily often feels that her mother could use some extra help, especially after her father died. So I found myself home alone. At first, the silence was strange, almost deafening. Suddenly, I had some free time, so I turned to a few friends. Since the weather was nice, we decided to get together to laugh, enjoy the sunshine, grill out, and eventually head to a bar for a drink. A few hours flew by, and after a few rounds, I was drunk, hungry, and ready to head home. By the time I got back, it was past midnight and my stomach was rumbling. I was craving something warm and comforting, so I decided to make dumplings. I put them in a pot, added the spices, and then realized I was out of salt. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should knock on the neighbor's door at this late hour. Hunger overcame caution. Turning off the cooker, I stepped out into the corridor and hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door next to mine. A few moments later, just as I was about to give up, I heard a rustle behind the door, followed by muffled swearing. The lock clicked and the door swung open, revealing my neighbor Jessica. She was clearly drunk, barefoot and wearing a loose nightgown that left little to the imagination. She had only recently moved in, and we hadn't had time to talk much beyond polite greetings in passing. Her hair was slightly disheveled and her eyes, though unfocused, carried a warmth that was hard not to notice. I asked if she had any salt I could borrow, and she looked at me with a playful glint in her eyes. "Neighbor, why so late?" she teased, biting her lip. Her voice was slightly slurred, but charming. She gestured for me to come in. "Have a seat. I'll check it out." I followed her into the sparsely furnished living room, just a bed, a few unopened boxes and clothes strewn on one of them. The room smelled faintly of wine and unpacked items. I took a seat on the bed, noticing a half-empty bottle of wine and a glass on the small table next to it. There was a strange, almost electric tension in the air. Jessica had returned, her nightgown barely tied and a glass of wine in her hand instead of salt. She sat down next to me, a mischievous smile never leaving her face. "No salt, I'm afraid," she said with mock regret in her voice. "But since you're here, how about a drink?" She poured us both a glass. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and we raised them together, an unspoken understanding between us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was filled with a sense of anticipation. She leaned closer, her warmth and the scent of wine intoxicating. "You're alone tonight, aren't you?" she whispered, her eyes full of desire and curiosity. I nodded and she moved even closer, pressing herself against me. Her breath was warm on my neck, and the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, charged with something we both felt but didn't yet realize. Before I knew it, I had already pulled her closer and my hands found the soft fabric of her nightgown. She seemed to have been waiting for this, her eyes closed as she pressed herself against me. The wine glass slipped from her hand, landing softly on the carpet without shattering. We fell back onto the bed, and what followed seemed inevitable, like something that had been building up since the moment I knocked on her door. Her touches were insistent, her kisses were demanding, and I reciprocated. There were no thoughts or hesitations in those moments, just the two of us, lost in the here and now. The night stretched on, each moment merging into the next. The bed creaked beneath us, our breathing heavy and synchronized. Jessica's fingers traced lines down my back, her touches alternating between gentle and demanding, like she was trying to memorize every inch of me. It was like a connection beyond the physical, something deeper that neither of us dared to name. At one point, the wine bottle tipped over, spilling onto the carpet, but we didn't care. Her quiet, gasping laughter filled the small room, and I smiled, feeling liberated. Here, in this dimly lit room, nothing else mattered. There was only Jessica, her warmth, her tantalizing touch, her half-closed eyes filled with need. Eventually, we lay pressed against each other, our breathing slowing. The room was filled with the mixed smells of wine, sweat, and something else, a sense of satisfaction. Jessica rested her head on my chest, her fingers lazily tracing patterns on my skin. We were silent, and the silence was comfortable, filled with the aftermath of what had just happened. I stared at the ceiling, my mind clouded, the events of the night replaying like a dream. Jessica moved slightly, raising herself up on her elbow to look at me. Her hair fell around her face in a haphazard halo, her eyes were soft and a smile played on her lips. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I like having a neighbor like you." There was a teasing note in her tone, but underneath it I heard something sincere, something that made my chest tighten. I smiled back, reaching up to brush a strand of hair away from her face. "I think I like having a neighbor like you too," I replied. It was a simple exchange, but it felt meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened and what it might mean. We didn't need to define it. It was enough that we were here, that we shared this moment. Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the curtains. I blinked, waking up, and the events of the night before came back to me. Jessica was still asleep, her face calm and her body pressed against mine. I watched her for a while, emotions bubbling up inside me, confusion, a hint of guilt, but also something else, a strange peacefulness. When she stirred, her eyes met mine, and all those thoughts seemed to disappear. She smiled, a lazy, warm smile that made my heart race. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. I smiled back and kissed her forehead gently. "Good morning," I replied just as gently. Whatever was next, we would face it when the time was right. For now, we had this moment, and it was enough.